Welcome to Martin Stephen Pellineros Taylor Show, Capitals Uncovered. We've got a breaking news show today. It's a innovation. We try to keep you up to date with the freshest and newest headlines, so you can listen to this while you're driving or something, because you won't have time. We scan the headlines so you don't have to, and assess their veracity. Martin, there's uh, while we won't necessarily talk about Iran, or at least I just want to focus our laser focus onto what's going on in Europe and Scandinavia,
Sure.
where the Swedes, the Scandinavians, are challenging the Russian oil tankers, and there've been a series of attacks on the oil refineries in the Baltic state, using Ukrainian drones based in the Baltic states, and hitting. It's a crazy. I mean, they're hitting oil refineries. It's war basically, and our friend Dirk, who we had on, 2 weeks ago, he's got a lot of contacts in Russia, and they're saying that the Russians are like, they're like near boiling point. Interestingly, though, if you look at TASS and Russia Today, I don't speak Russian and I don't have access to the other websites, but they are not, they're completely mum about this. And of course, Putin is being accused of being too soft on everyone, and especially Scandinavians or whatever. So there's nothing there, and you could think, well, that all is okay with the world. They're totally focused on Iran, but behind the scenes, a lot of Russians are angry at what's going on, and that the Scandinavians get away with it, making a big headline in the Finnish press about Ukraine, about drones hitting Finland or landing in Finland. Well, guess what? They're Ukrainian drones, but they don't say that. They imply that it's Russian drones. They don't actually. If you read between the lines and read at the bottom of the article, it's clear that it's kind of Ukrainian drones. But the way, so they are sending Ukrainian drones into Russia. They then crash en route or whatever, or maybe possibly Russians are sending drones back, and suddenly it's the Russians are attacking us. I mean, it's so dishonest. But this is how these wars work. You create provocations, and when the other side does something, it's they're the guys who are provoking. But I think it's Ukrainian drones anyway. I've got another source who is also very worried because Britain last week sort of went below the radar. Starmer, who I think has had a very good stand on Iran, why can't they be just as logical and reasonable about Ukraine? I mean, the British and the Scandinavians have this crazy, I don't know, mental block about the Russians. I can see both perspectives on Iran. They say it's crazy to escalate there and we can't win. But with Ukraine, no, it's totally different. So people, I think, been deranged the last couple of years. Suddenly, it's as if they've had a jab or something that wakes them up, and they advance perfectly reasonable arguments about not provoking Iran. And I thought, well, hang on, where have you been for the last couple of years? So you are capable of thought. It's just when it comes to you're like a little Nazi when you talk about Russia. Anyway, the BBC had an article, a kind of triumphalist article about Britain being prepared to board Russian ships if they cross into British territorial waters. I don't know if that includes the Channel, because of course British and French territorial waters meet in the middle. So although the Channel is an international waterway, they might say, well, it's not for this purpose and we'll stop you. But if it'll extend the Russian journeys to far north of Shetlands or whatever. And of course, the Scandinavians are now doing the same. I mean, they look up to Britain. What Britain does, the little Scandinavians have to follow. And a source I've got who's got quite good connections with the intelligence services and the securocrats says the Swedes Defense Minister Paul Jonsson are quite alarmist and speak about an upcoming war like the Danes, while Norway is a little bit less dramatic. But still, they believe in an upcoming attack from Russia. There was a Danish study that concluded with an upcoming Russian attack in a few years' time, which, if I remember correctly, was thinking in terms of capabilities, as their intention, the Russians' intention, was obvious. This means that Scandinavian money goes into the military forces and to Ukraine military forces and not to the welfare state. But the more immediate problem is that the sanctions on Russia that are considered legally binding, which means that the Swedish special forces are boarding Russian civilian ships, and if I understand it correctly, outside Swedish territorial waters, and claim that this or that paper is wrong, and you do not let the ship continue. This can lead to quite a lot of trouble. All right, so I've I don't follow Scandinavian news that closely, but I have a glance at the Swedish state television website, which is like the official, I don't know, news website, the closest thing to, and they don't talk about this. But I don't know if that's good news or bad news. It could be bad news. It means that they're doing this under the radar and they're getting away with it. I mean, I know that the Scandinavian, we're talking about the European elites being young, inexperienced, very aggressive, very stupid. I mean, if we think Trump is stupid, they're worse. Um, and they are convinced that Russia's about to attack them. So they create the very conditions that they say they're trying to avoid, which is a Russian attack by provoking Russia. I can't understand the logic, but they think the Russian war on them is inevitable. And they're stuck in their little Swedish peace for 200 years, naive little Scandinavian welfare state bubble where they've been cosplaying wars for centuries. They've been kept out of Europe's wars, fortunately. And there's a kind of, and they think this is their big thing. This is the big confrontation with evil, and all Scandinavian leaders are like that. And it worries me that while we're all looking at Iran, something will happen in Scandinavia, backed, by the British. You're always happy to have someone else fight their fight, like sort of the next Ukrainians, if you like. But so that's all what I wanted to draw attention to, and we've got. And the other thing, which is sort of related, I mean, we've got Bucha symbolizes cruelty of Russia's war against Ukraine. EU's Kallas said they're going to call the Russians to account, put Putin on trial, and all that. All these menopausal prime minister women standing, looking very serious with their fucking candles, as they always do, in front of some memorial or other. And I think there's a good case for Bucha being a hoax. And if it wasn't a hoax, it was a very rare one-off massacre by Russian soldiers. Probably it was Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, okay, I'll leave it open that it was possibly one or the other, but I've seen evidence going both ways. But I mean, anyway, it was like 200, is it? I mean, the Israelis have massacred tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. I did an analysis the other day of murder rates in different countries compared to the civilian death rate in Ukraine and the civilian death rate in Gaza. If you talk about, so in the murder rate in Europe is about 2, and the murder rate in USA is about 5. The murder rate in South Africa is about 40. The murder rate in Ukraine, if you converted the civilian death toll into murder rates, as it were, it's 11. So it's only a little bit over twice the American rate, and probably much lower than the rate in Baltimore or Chicago. Okay, so that's the Ukrainian. So it's probably the best war for civilians ever. Okay, so I mean, because the Russians have been very, very careful not to kill civilians. Despite the, you've had these enormous headlines in the British press in the last couple of years, massacre attack, and it turns out in the small print, one person wounded or something. So the Russians have been very, very careful, or as things go. Anyway, but the Gaza was like 1,500, so 150 times more people are dying in Gaza. Civilians are dying in Gaza than did in the Ukraine war. But of course, where are the stupid little Euro politicians with their candles when over the Gaza conflict?
Yes.
Anyway, so that occupies the Guardian front page today. So they're still really into Project Ukraine, and I'm wondering because Trump said today, as a friend of peace, I'm thinking, does Trump's Iran war and Trump's estrangement from the Europeans today, there's headlines saying, you can get your own oil because you didn't help us when we needed you last week. Um, and you can, and what's the point of NATO? I think Rubio said today, because, you know, NATO is an alliance, and the Rubio argument is that we need your help. We called for your help. Of course, it's out of area and it's not Article 5 because America was the aggressor. Even so, it seems to be, European US relations are at an all-time low. Now, just as a friend of peace, I always supported the Greenland crisis, actually, mostly because I thought, well, if
I
it
remember.
because it keeps those bloody Danes down because they're so arrogant they're like the Israelis of the north. They go around strutting around, thinking they can always call on America when the need be, and they control the straits that allow ships, cargo ships from St. Petersburg to go to the world. And they've always been toying with this idea and stopping and boarding them. They're even more aggressive than the Swedes. Well, I thought, well, if the Americans take them down a peg by saying we're going to take Greenland, then the Danes are not so arrogant anymore. So I was practically the only person in Scandinavia who supported the Americans on this because I thought, well, the Danes are too big headed for their own good. Anyway, if does this tiff between the Americans and the Europeans over Iran mean that the uh, Scandinavians will be more restrained in Europe than they might otherwise have been because they can't rely on American support? I don't know, because yeah. I don't know what you think. I mean, because how does
Well,
deterrence work? Yeah,
no, no, I mean, I think you've summed it up frighteningly well. And the thought came to me as you were summing up, Pele, that what you're describing the schizophrenic behavior of the Europeans, as you say, reasonable on Iran, maniacal against the Russians. And then you look at President Trump and the people around him, and they're exactly the opposite. They're also schizophrenic, except they flip the schizophrenia.
I know.
They are much more responsible than the Europeans on Russia. And when I am accused, as I am routinely accused right, left, and center, including from my own kids, of supporting out of control fascism in America, because I supported Trump's policies on Ukraine as opposed to Biden policies and his people around him. And now, of course, my son and daughters are rightly saying to me, "We told you so, Dad, you're an old fool." Because look at what Trump is doing on Iran. It's insane, it's wicked, it's crazy. And they are absolutely right, of course. And I try to acknowledge it. And even then, I think I only come across as an ineffectual old liberal trying to win cheap favor and therefore become even more a figure of despicable contempt of the Ancien regime in their eyes. Well, that's life. But uh, it's the same schizophrenia, except it's reversed. But in both cases, it's mad. I think we have to go back to Freud on this. I think you point in the right direction. This business about it's all these lady leaders in a feminized Europe, always standing up with such dignity in front of candles as they wave the finger towards the Russians. One of the definitive history works that shaped my thinking all my life. And I never had the privilege of meeting this gentleman. And I think as a military historian, he was actually a joke and a menace, but as a diplomatic and cultural and psychological historian, and most of an economic, he's a genius. The late Lord Corelli Barnett, who was the only historian of his generation who Margaret Thatcher thought worthy of putting into the House of Lords, which at least in those days was a more eminent honor than it had most certainly devalued to in the golden age of Tony Blair and his equally ghastly successors since then. But Lord Corelli Barnett in The Collapse of British Power talks about this extraordinary romance the British middle classes and upper classes and the nonconformists. Again, an area you talk about in Scandinavia, the Protestants who aren't Protestant anymore. They've lost the fundamentalist fire and spine and backbone of their great traditional Calvinist faith. And instead, all we have is this contemptible, wimpy, soggy liberalism. Oh, can't we all get along? Jesus was always so meek and mild. Read the Gospels, you idiot. Jesus was not meek and mild almost all of the time. He was dynamic, he was brave, he was forceful, he was outrageous. And I would maintain you see him hanging out with Roman centurions all the time throughout the Gospels. And much of his thought is not from traditional Jewish rabbinic thinking. Some is. He's both. But he also picks up from the hard, ruthless, clear, strategic thinking from the Romans he hung out, and they were soldiers he hung out with. Should an army with 1,000 men go against an army with 2,000 men or 10,000 men? He asks in the Gospels. It's not the way a rabbi talked. It's the way a Roman centurion talked. It's the way a Roman strategist talked. It's hard, practical, real thinking. And what was Jesus? He was a self-employed businessman. He was into construction. That's what the term carpenter means. He didn't just cut wood or into two by fours. He built houses. He had to hire people who worked with him. I'm digressing here, but this is old, traditional, hard, fundamentalist, not fundamentalist, fundamental, with respect for the text and respect for the history, Protestant Christianity, engaging with the realities of what Jesus said and what Paul said too. Instead, you throw that aside and we have what you are talking about, this wimpy, soggy hypocrisy. And at the same time as we bring in Freud here. Freud talks about id and superego. Superego is the conscience. And Freud says that whenever the conscience is extended to an extraordinary, distorted, fantastical degree, you're actually covering up really nasty primal forces in the id, in the subconscious. What's the id? It's hatred, it's jealousy, it's sexual drive, it's wanting to be laid. It's all the things we say we are superior to in our state of civilization. And Freud says, no, they're all there, and you got to acknowledge them, because if you deny them, they get more power rather than less. Mm. But what did we see in Victorian England? As I hope to bring out in my study on who Jack the Ripper was, which we will be doing in the near future. What did we see then? What did we see in Imperial England? What did we see with the League of Nations? What do we see today? We see that simultaneously you have schizophrenia, just like you say. On the one hand, the Europeans and the Americans are so high-minded, the Israelis too, of course, and the British. So we're all so high-minded. Pure. We're outraged at the evil genocidal Iranians. We're outraged at the thuggish, monstrous Russians. We wag the finger at them morally every time. We bring in 1920s and 30s terms the League of Nations on up against them. War was abolished by 50 nations and more in 1928, including Britain, France, and America. And it was taken seriously. The Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact by the Foreign Minister of France and by the Secretary of State of the United States. And it was a Republican conservative figure who was Secretary of State, Frank Kellogg, at the time. War was abolished. And the League of Nations was there. And what would happen if a country, like, for example, Japan in 1931 in Manchuria, or Hitler in 1938 against Austria and Czechoslovakia, broke the solemn covenant and simply invaded and took over other countries? It could not last, because the League would not let it. The moral authority of 28 nations covering 80% of the world is against you. Well, big deal. Are you ready to send a million soldiers to fight Japan or 3 million soldiers to fight Germany to stop this? No, you are not. And these idiots to this day cannot see it. And they cannot see their own danger. Japan was a loyal friend and ally of Britain from 1900 to the 1920s. And then the British abandoned the Japanese alliance and grievously humiliated and insulted the Japanese government at the time. The prime ministers of Australia and New Zealand, who had a healthy respect for the power and dignity of Japan, warned against it. Winston Churchill was all in favor of it. He refused to fund the British defenses in the Far East, especially the naval base in Singapore, throughout the 1920s. And he wrote this in official memorandum, argued it in cabinet repeatedly. Why a war against Japan, said the great prophet? It is inconceivable in our lifetime. Mm. And 20 years later, 15 years later, they took the British Empire away from him. And then Churchill lied. The idea that Singapore could be a fortress with no guns pointing inland to protect it was inconceivable to me. You might as well launch a ship without a bottom. Why was this never brought to my attention? It's all your fault. It was brought to his attention repeatedly. He ignored it. And in the 1920s, he was single-handedly responsible for scrapping the funds that the Royal Navy demanded to defend Singapore.
Okay.
He lied, he lied, he lied. And this is what we see here. We see the superego and the id, and this explains what you're seeing in Europe and in Scandinavia. The more high minded these sweet, saintly ladies in front of their candles with full dignity become, the more irrational and suicidal they are. They are not deliberately, but subconsciously, they are provoking Russia to invade Sweden,
Mm.
to invade Germany. It didn't just start even in the time of Swedish neutrality. There is strong evidence from defectors and other sources, and it was brought to my attention in the 1980s that there were Soviet operational plans to destroy the cities of Sweden in the event that Sweden joined NATO or joined a full-scale war against the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And with tidal waves, they were very specific how they would do it. Hydrogen bombs detonated at the bottom of the Baltic, directed to send massive tidal waves against the main port cities of
Mm.
against Stockholm itself
Mm.
and against the other port cities of Sweden. I'm glad you're 50 miles in
Mm.
from Gothenburg. Hopefully that's enough. Now, of
So
course,
yeah, so it's
yeah,
yeah, just this point that the
no,
Europeans and the
please,
Scandinavians, they're moralistic and totally
yes,
unrealistic at the same
yes,
time.
it
And that
goes
goes
together.
that's this and it goes back to a misinterpretation of the Bible because Jesus was much more of a realist than we think. So it's a kind of distortion. Just I'm trying to summarize your talk there. It's a kind
No,
of
you're
distortion of
absolutely right.
understanding of Christianity, partly because it's dissipated or weakened from its original enthusiasm, and it's become a sort of it's become dangerous to itself and to the rest of us because they're not um, they substitute morality for realism. They're delusional and they're extremely provocative. It's a bit like I don't know. It's like a woman in a relationship with a high-minded but wrong-headed woman in a relationship with I don't know, maybe an abuser or a strong guy. Putin is the man, and Europe is the woman, is the nagging woman in a way, and not and in a way it's like it's a dysfunctional male-female relationship, the relationship between Russia and Europe at the moment.
That's
And
brilliant.
I've known women friends or relations, I should say, where I understand the man completely. I mean, and I thought, well, if I could just sit in her shoes, and because a lot of women marry kind of men who are lawyers or businessmen and so on, and they make a lot of money. But if you make a lot of money, you don't have to spend your time going through the sort of school of emotions, you know, and they're quite square and sometimes borderline autistic. So you get the money and you get that, and you get a guy who drives a fast car, but they're not always the kind of guy that you want. And I can handle it. Men know how to handle it. Other men, it's like a negotiation, but women don't. And it's I can see them going to the buzzsaw straight away, uh, and they don't have the right approach or equipment, mental equipment or emotional equipment. And that's where Europe's at the moment. It's very, very dangerous, you know. Um, this incredibly one-sided and provocative going to Busha, which, as said, may have been a MI6 operation just to make the Ukrainians impossible for them to back down just after the Boris Johnson said fight on. And now they've turned it into a piece of history. Are they going to commemorate for the next 50 years? Ridiculous. It's like, is our history completely built on bullshit and MI6 operations, and we're
Yes,
instantiating that into our official history? Is there going to be a little
yes,
monument outside Bucha, and Estonian politicians for decades ahead are going to go and stand there with their little candles, you know? If
yes,
you yeah,
yes, there will be
yeah.
because there has been. Exactly.
And then under
Uh,
the new European and articles that escape the new European all-encompassing communist type censorship laws, we get jailed for questioning the myth of Bucha. You know, we'll be
Look,
called a Bucha denier.
for more than 100 years, more my time than yours, the great first Indian national rising against the British Empire in the 1857, was it's still called in Britain, the Indian Mutiny. At least in my time, it still was the Indian Mutiny. and much time was given to genuinely horrific cases of rape and massacre by rebellious Indian sepoys, native Indian troops against British women and children who were there. And this happened, especially the notorious case where hundreds of people, civilians, mainly women and children, were slaughtered in Cawnpur, and their remains were found down a well in Cawnpur by the British army sent to rescue. The Victorian armies always came too late to prevent massacres, right? Well, there was outrage over this. And what was the result of the outrage? Hundreds of British people had been slaughtered in horrific circumstances, parallel to Gaza here, where it starts with a monstrous attack by Hamas, the torture and massacre of women and children, which is really documented. They even boasted of it at the time. But what's the response? The response is to kill 10, 20, 100 times as many Palestinian civilians in Gaza without end afterwards. They don't just go after the killers, or to get the killers. They don't care who else they slaughter. And this happens in wars all the time, of course. But in the Indian Mutiny, I was never told when I was growing up, I was never told when I was given this regular imperial conventional British history, that from the Indian perspective, the war is called the First War of National Liberation, and that the British army reoccupying northern India killed up to 1 million people, most overwhelmingly civilians, not the sepoys, not just them. They killed 1 million people. They killed multiple thousands. It may have been as many as tens of thousands. They understandably fudged the figures afterwards by putting them in front of, strapping them in front of cannons, you know, the old-fashioned cannons you see in all the movies, and blowing cannonballs through individuals.
Wow.
It wasn't cost effective, of course, so you couldn't massacre most of them that way, but thousands of people were slaughtered that way, not just the guilty, but the innocent too, and the innocent bystanders, because they had the taste for doing it, and because they thought, in Voltaire's great phrase, he said, from time to time, the English shoot an admiral pour encourager les autres, to encourage the rest of them. It was done as an example. And also, of course, it was done because the people who were doing the killing got a taste for it. They got a taste for it.
But Martin, sorry, we got to wind up here.
Sure.
But is the point you're making in relation to my point? Is it that we've got
Yes.
this lies in history, basically, and we got the Butcher lie
Yes.
and we got the mutiny lie? I have to say, I hadn't heard of it, and you know, I'm pretty good at alternative history. So you've just taught me
Very
something, and I'm gonna have to scurry to my. I don't know where we can read about these things because Wikipedia, of course, is not a very reliable source. You know, it's very
well.
connected. Do you have a book or
You know,
suggestion for our eager beaver?
actually, I would start with a novel, and then go to the documentation. And Flashman, I think. Oh, I will. The Flashman novel that deals with the Indian Mutiny. At my age, I forget the exact title. It will be
Okay,
by
yeah,
George MacDonald Fraser.
that's right.
But why don't we have Mani Shankar IR, the former cabinet minister of India,
That's
back
right.
on the show
Yeah,
just to talk about this? Because
yeah.
Mani knows it all backwards.
I
He'll
mean,
give
as I
us the
said, the reason
documentation.
why many Indians didn't go with the West in this conflict is that they have a completely different historical interpretation. I mean, because
Exactly.
the West always says, "Oh, well, Stalin starved all these Ukrainians in the Holodomor." Yeah, sure, fine, but I mean, the British did just the same thing, right, in India, except we don't learn. The Russians assassinate people, but we don't assassinate people. So you get a
And
completely
Hitler
distorted
modeled
view.
his plans for Lebensraum, for exterminating the Jewish, Polish, Russian peoples, and many Ukrainians too. He was rather split on the Ukrainians, but he didn't have much respect for them, to put it mildly. But Hitler modeled all that on the history of the British Empire, which he
Yeah.
had studied closely.
Exactly. So, I mean, what happened to the original I mean, the South Africans when I was down there said, "Oh, those bloody Australians! They come and lecture us because the difference is we didn't kill our blacks and the Australians did. So they've got no one to left."
Yes, exactly.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, we've got to wind up there.
Of
So
course. But
do.
look,
Okay. Thanks,
thank
Martin.
you.
All right.
Hugely important, especially for us on this side of the pond, Pelly.
All right.